Everyone, and welcome to our Well Expert Interview series. I'm so excited to be joined by Clare Epke. She is the guru, the go-to, the expert that works with our performance testing organizations, or PT orgs. If you don't know what that is, we're going to be talking more about what is a PT org. PT orgs are critical to all the work that we do at the International Well Building Institute because, of course, well certification relies on verification. And verification is led by performance testing organizations. They are the people that are on site testing, understanding how you are meeting the requirements of well. And we're just in for such a treat today because Clare has been on the ground doing this work. She has worked for multiple different groups and understanding how to set the standards, the instrumentation that's used. She works with teams that are educating and advising clients, and she's going to give you all the details. And we're going to talk through some of the other elements of PT org, such as the business case behind becoming a PT org. We're also going to talk about some of the lessons learned on the ground. They're going to be very, very useful, both for you if you are a client, a future project, and or if you'd like to be trained to be a PT agent or be a PT org. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Clare and just to have you introduce yourself to our audience and tell them a little bit about your background and your experience working in this space.
Thanks, Whitney. I'm just really excited to be here today and glad I can share a little bit of my experience and expertise in performance testing. I am a senior manager of performance testing at IWBI. I've been here for 3 years. Prior to that, I was one of the first performance testing agents for GBCI back when we had 6 testing agents to cover the globe in 2014 through 2018. And that is when performance testing opened up to third-party organizations. So I helped to train the first round of other organizations outside of GBCI, and then myself helped to set up the performance testing organization for another firm before joining IWBI. Currently part of the standard development team and am responsible for still the global training of all of our new performance testing agents, and also reviewing applications for testing organizations and supporting project teams around performance verification, but also testing agents when they are in the throes of testing any project site issues that come up, equipment issues, lab questions. Then I do help support those on a tier 3 level. As part of the standard development team, I'm also working on a large project to really look at simplification of performance verification, and really excited to add some efficiency and add kind of the voice of how do all of these different subject matter experts get their information into the guidebook, but then how is it executable as one service, a limited amount of time. So continually providing feedback and experience on what's it like to execute these tests in the field and what is reasonable to balance between rigor and executability in the actual building.
Got it. And let's talk numbers. So how many performance testing orgs do we have? And then how many performance testing agents do we have globally?
Sure. Currently, we have 71 performance testing organizations globally, and we have over 500 trained performance testing agents. Not all of those agents belong to a performance testing organization. So that's one of the nuances, is that while you can go through the training to become a performance testing agent, in order to actually perform testing on site for well purposes, your organization must go through an application and enrollment. And then as an agent, you can conduct well performance testing through your organization. And the reason that we do that is because we do want to continue to uphold the rigor and quality. And so individuals are not currently free agents, as you would say. You must belong to an organization whose quality process has been reviewed, so that we know each agent is getting the support from their organization around the quality and rigor of the requirements that they're executing.
So let's go super basic. So for those joining that may not understand what a performance testing agent, a performance testing org is, can you just walk through a basic process from the moment that they call us and say there is a client that is interested in pursuing WELL certification, what are going to be the touch points that performance testing agent is going to take with the client to help them get certified?
Yeah, so really the performance testing agent is engaged by the project team in a couple of ways. We often see project teams engaging agents at the beginning of their kind of conceptualizing and trying to determine if WELL is a pathway for them. And so they're trying to budget and they're trying to really think long term toward the end of the project, what is this cost? So really performance testing agents are engaged at the beginning, which is a really tough thing for them because performance testing costs vary quite a bit depending on the level of certification, the type of project, all the nuances regarding how many different space types. And so um, testing agents often get a really tough ask, which is how much will my 50,000 square foot, 200,000 square foot building cost? And that's really sometimes all the information that they get, but knowing that there are so many nuances regarding the quantities of tests, the level of certification, and what actually your fit out of the building would be. Um, Testing agents do their best, and I provide some parameters around how they can give some sort of accurate pricing for budgeting, and that usually is to try to budget pricing for just the minimum certification and prerequisites so that they can kind of nail that down in some way for budget purposes. But so that's one way our agents are engaged, and the other is usually after documentation review and after construction. So something different about WELL performance testing versus other ratings or other certifications such as LEED, which we're all very familiar with, is WELL performance testing is trying to measure the impact of the occupant's experience. And so we do require testing to be done after occupancy. So for LEED, it's before occupancy. And so how I feel we really differentiate is we're doing testing in occupied buildings under normal operating conditions. So we're really getting a point in time in which we really understand and can measure what the occupant is experiencing. And so the second way agents are engaged is when the team is ready for performance testing. They've often had tenants move in or the building is occupied and they are now at the performance testing phase and really need an agent to conduct the well-required testing.
So I want to get into some of the stories. So lots of things can happen. There are beautiful projects, buildings around the world that are designed with some of the best intentions in mind to achieve WELL certification. From one of the early projects, I know that they were going to WELL certify and people had brought in their artwork, and the artwork was formaldehyde-laden $1 million installation, and it wasn't on the original, cut sheet when they were going through the final inspection, but it absolutely impacted the measuring of the space. So people, I sometimes call them messy variables when it comes to this research, do things that we don't intend. And so to come in after occupancy and test, sometimes we're also having to navigate some pretty real life scenarios that we didn't necessarily intend. So I want to get into some of the stories on the ground and some of the experiences that you've had. Would you be willing to sort of start with sharing with us what are some of those, moments that you've been in the field where maybe the test didn't come back as intended, and you really had to navigate and work with the client to better understand how we're going to be able to address some of these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot there in that story. There's, the typically we're there gathering data, and it's in several different tests over 3 to 5 days. And that is the biggest question that we have from people in the building or people who have observed our equipment. They're always very curious. What are you testing to be passed? And they tend to ask you that on the spot. But typically, that is one of the things that we shy away from on the spot at the project because it is really a large set of data, hundreds and hundreds of megabytes of data that we do collect and then make our calculations out of. So while we're on site, we're not often seeing the end result unless something is hugely spiking and very a direct read instrument like for particulates, you can see that on the screen if there's a large spike in particulates, and you can kind of address that immediately. But a lot of times we're multitasking, equipment is set up gathering the information, and then we're taking it and analyzing it over a number of days after we leave the site. So that is one point to make. The other point is that we do collect laboratory samples, and those are, have a little bit of a lead time, a couple of weeks before we get the results. One of the challenging things as a performance testing agent is that you are a neutral third party agent. And so that is for a couple of reasons. Of course, you want to be taking the tests and delivering sometimes bad news without any conflict of interest or any otherwise interest in the project. So you want to be delivering all the news, whether it's good or bad, or causing delays or rework of construction or whatever it might be. Performance testing agents are really delivering the information, can give very detailed notes of what their observation was to help the project team determine what could have been the source. But the testing agents are not able, due to conflict of interest, really advise on what they specifically think the issue was or what they should do about it. So those are a couple of ways in which our testing agents are kept neutral and really not getting influenced by, relationships with project teams or, different factors that could influence the result. They are really just taking the information, doing a scientific analysis of it, and delivering whatever the result might be.
And that's really also why it's so important that teams that bring on consultants that are well APs will actually be there when you're doing the on-site testing. Is that right? And so you do have, as a project, you do have an advocate who's also working through the whole process with you to help interpret that information when it's received. And I assume that you've seen quite a bit of that on the ground when there is a well AP that's also working with you through the testing.
Yeah, we definitely prefer to have a project team member who is familiar with the well goals and the scorecard in the building. Oftentimes, we do get people assigned to be on site with us who are, maybe office support or not very familiar with the building, which they need to be. Sometimes I've been on site where we need to do sound testing with the HVAC system on, because if it were off, we're really not getting the impact that the occupant would experience. And so sometimes that person on site would need to know how to, for instance, turn the HVAC back on so that we could do our sound testing. I've also had a time on site where we were working quite late because lighting is done after daylight hours, and depending on the year, it can be 1 or 2 a.m. And the building system shut off, including the locks of the doors and all the lights except for emergency lighting in the building. And so needing someone on site to accompany you is for many different reasons, but in that case, it was definitely for our safety and for our ability to finish the test, but also safely get ourselves in and out of the building at those late hours. So we really, really recommend someone on site who knows the building, maybe a facility manager or the well AP who has been consulting on the project versus, just anyone who might be available to stay and be with the performance testing agent.
Yeah. And sometimes the results you get back are not what is expected. And I'd love for you to share some of your stories where when we do receive this information, we're not just testing the building, we are testing the conditions for people in the buildings. And so as a first response, we need to always be thinking about people's health and well-being in the process. And so I would love for you to share in particular some of the stories and experience you've had with testing lead in water and how you convey that information back to the client.
Absolutely. I did have a very specific experience in which, by the time a project gets to performance testing, they've been through a long, either documentation review, a long construction process, and performance verification is the last step to certification. And so they're very anxious. And then, of course, there's probably some business starting up in this new space, or, timeline for the project team. And so often getting um, unfavorable results has a larger impact on the project team versus just, how do I fix this? It kind of delays some of their business if it's something that is really impacting health. And so in a test that I did perform myself, I found elevated levels of lead. And so kind of balancing as a third party neutral performance testing agent. At the time, this was version 1, the process was slightly different. The agents were not allowed to share any results. They had to go through a formal review to be sure that your calculations were correct before sharing results with the project team. But I really felt strongly that this is an immediate health um, um, hazard and something that we wanted the project team to know immediately, having occupants in the building consuming this water. And so we did share that result, double checked, of course, all of the lab results to make sure there was no question that we did find elevated levels of lead, and shared this with the project team. This ended up having an impact beyond just that project because this was a historic project that had been built onto. And so the design team understood that the infrastructure of their water system was not new within the building and was fed from a lot of old infrastructure. In this particular city, the city had provided, and kind of was something great that they like to kind of announce about their city, is there is free drinking water and these beautiful ornate fountains throughout the city, in which the public could get safe drinking water. And so through finding the source in one building, the city expanded their testing and found that throughout the city there was also lead in those amazing public fountains. And so the ripple effect of that in this community was a great example of the people that are impacted by these tests. And so a lot of times, again, as I said, the project teams are very anxious to get certified, and there are, business cases and reasons why they need to earn their certification to move on or to close out, or, services need to end and contracts are in place and such. However, it is a balance between, you don't just want your plaque, right? You want to know that you're delivering a healthy project. And in this case, expanding beyond just this one building to the water fountains throughout the city was a very tangible and impactful way that ended up impacting more than just the building it was in, but the broader community the building was in as well.
And it really becomes a public service to be able to detect a hazard and report on it in a timely fashion. And it really leads me to my next question about how performance testing agents really work to make the invisible visible. So from my background in leading research and focused on public health, is that we often don't know what the enemy is when it comes to air quality. We don't know necessarily what is good or bad. And air quality is a particularly interesting one. We have certain biofeedback loops to be able to detect problems. So if formaldehyde, or if we have a heavy metal in water, that's an interesting one as well. And your brain will actually try to get you away from risk. It will give you a headache, you have fatigue. It will give you some indicator that something's wrong. There are other hazards in the environment, such as carbon monoxide, that we don't have a strong biofeedback loop for. And that is why it's so dangerous that if you're exposed, often while asleep in a home, that people can actually perish. So we're not able to detect these issues. So it's really important that we test our environment, our indoor environment in particular in this case. So I wanted you to sort of expand on this concept of making the invisible visible. And so I really see performance testing agents and organizations as taking the conditions in the building and giving you data that gives you a better sense of, is the actual building performing? So you're providing a diagnostic test. And one of the analogies that I sort of like to put forward, but when sometimes people think they're healthy and they go to the doctor. And it's not until you run the test and the screens that you find that you've got high cholesterol, or that you need to address a vitamin deficiency. So oftentimes buildings, this might be a big opportunity, and maybe one of the first times there's been such a comprehensive diagnostic test of the building for WELL certification. And often our PT agents are working with data that can enable people to understand better what is going on, make that invisible indoor air quality and indoor environmental quality visible in new ways. And would love for you to just sort of touch upon that topic. And I think the real authority that we put forward with our PT agents, that they are able to use the science and data to better inform our clients around the conditions of their buildings.
Absolutely. When you were speaking to making the invisible visible, and a somewhat funny story has come to mind in which I was doing testing in a high-end residential project. It was one of the first multifamily residential to go through testing. In this case, since I was doing particulate matter testing in the lobby, and since it was a high traffic area, I didn't want to leave my equipment and multitask. So in this case, I was looking at the screen and could see a very high level of particulate matter. And also part of being a performance testing agent is to really write down everything that is happening in that moment. Since we can't say or speculate why this is happening, the things that I wrote down, there was a porte cochere and the doors were opening, there were idling cars outside, but also notably a dog walker had come in with 3 or 4 dogs. And so she stopped at the reception desk and was having a conversation. And at that time, just that short amount of time that those dogs were in the space, their dander was causing a spike in particulate matter. And so what was interesting to see was how the HVAC system did respond to that and dissipate the dander after the pets left. And so that really is what the system is intended to do. We know these things will happen every now and then, but can the system get back to a normal, healthy operating state? And so had I not been there or observed that, it would have been such a mystery to understand what happened in that moment and made the particulate spike. But since particulate matter testing and all testing we do is not just one moment in time, the project didn't fail because we had a whole hour of test points in which we could see the particulate went back down to a healthy, acceptable range. So that's one very visible way that I could happen to see what happened to the air at that moment, and that the HVAC system did what it was intended to do, dissipated the contaminants, and got back to a healthy operating setting. So that was kind of an interesting and kind of funny story. And then we've also had many project teams in office settings ask if having pets in the office matters, and ask specifically, will it matter if you're doing testing on a day that we allow pets? And so from that experience, we absolutely know it will. However, if that's going to be something that happens regularly, we want those anomalies during testing because the building and the project should be able to be designed for these scenarios and not stay at elevated levels, not recirculate whatever contaminants in the air, but to dissipate and filter. And so really performance testing, we always tell project teams and agents that while we're there, the locations that we select to do testing, we really don't share those ahead of time because we don't want them to be prepped for in only those areas. For a well-certified building, you should be able to walk into any of the spaces that are regularly occupied and they would pass at any given day and time that they're typically occupied. And so performance testing really does capture that by doing somewhat guided but random test locations so that we know any occupant on any day experiencing this building will be getting what we're delivering, which is a well building that has, thresholds and verified healthy environment.
It's a huge point. So there's not a constant throughout the day. So people are different from when they wake up till when they go to sleep, and the building has to be able to essentially evolve throughout the day. So there's different demands on the system that it must meet. So I think too often there's a conversation that if we just monitored the building's air quality, for example, we would then be able to reduce down any problems. And actually, I think sometimes the conversation is a bit more of when there is a problem, how fast was the system able to respond? So, and I encourage everyone to be in a when conversation, not an if. So when there is a pandemic, when there is a wildfire, not if there's going to be. So you're testing not just does your system work, but you're testing the resiliency, which is the definition is its ability to basically cope with the demands.
Mhm.
So if it can cope with the demands of the system, then we know it's going to be more resilient in times of crisis. And we saw that play forward in well certifications that happened around the wildfires and of course during COVID. I don't know if you wanted to share any stories on that front.
Um, yeah, I think some of the, things that come up certainly around wildfires that have been looked at not only by IWBI, but many air quality experts. So given climate change and how prevalent wildfires are, it's typically written that these are anomalies in standard language. However, we now know these are seasonal. Wildfires aren't anomalies in some parts of the world. They are, there's a season that they're predictable. People try to mitigate, but they happen regularly. So then the question becomes, do we design the building for an anomaly or do we design the building to handle what we know is going to happen every season? And kind of stop using that crutch as this is an anomaly because it's happening regularly. And so we should be designing toward that regular known worst case versus, the sunshiny day with good air quality. So I think that that's an interesting point.
Mhm.
And the sensitivity of the devices absolutely show um, any sort of, I mean, dog dander, right? So they'd absolutely show any small introduction of contaminants. Um, and as you said, the building should be able to um, handle that, filter it, and return to a healthy state of being. Not sure if I answered your question or not there.
Well, and I think that the take-home point is that historically, even from the field of industrial hygiene, we were trying to monitor when there was a problem and
Mm,
detect the source and address that. In well, we are looking at how to promote health. So there are tests that we do to reduce risk, and we know harmful levels of risk, like organic and or inorganic contaminants in water. But then we move on to light. Light's different, right? We're going to say that there is a maximum that we recommend that you try to meet because it will benefit
mhm,
human health. But if you don't do it, it's not the same risk as being exposed to lead. And so it's really important as we, are advocates and experts in healthy buildings, is that we're not just talking about reducing risk. We're talking about promoting health. And the
mhm,
test for that varies also. The time, the duration, the laboratories that we work with. And so I kind of like to close out and touching upon some of the global challenges that our PT orgs face and the business case behind the importance of doing this work. So we need experts, and these experts need to be able to understand not only the purpose, the goal, go through the training and education, be able to operate these tools, but also often have to navigate that what we know from a human health perspective and the levels we recommend are very difficult to meet in certain locations in the world.
mhm.
And even when they are met, it can be challenging to work with laboratories and other regional testing, agents. So I would love for you to just sort of close out and speaking about, I think the real responsibility and role from our performance testing orgs globally to navigate that when we know we have the right science and research, we still have to train, educate, and execute buildings to be able to meet those standards, which often means thinking through different areas of the world's challenges with laboratories and testing that is still not the same.
Mm, mhm.
So over to you on kind of the bigger scope of how IWBI as a global organization is addressing that.
Absolutely. Um, you bring to mind a story of doing a test in Mexico City. As we know, historically, Mexico's water quality is not delivered at the same kind of level or filtration in the US or even other parts of the world. And so in Mexico, it's known we don't drink the water, right? And so um, this building had actually had a reverse osmosis system on their, it was a tenant, so it was on their floor. And so really changing the mindset of the occupants that you can't drink water on any other floor, but you can drink the water on your floor. We promise, right? And so this was culturally not something that they ever did. And then also the nuance of like you can't drink it on any other floor except for yours. And so in that case, typically performance testing agents just order the lab supplies and fill the water themselves, and send it off for analysis. So some of the challenges I had in that case were the local labs did not allow you to collect the water. So they sent personnel, and that personnel showed up in a full hazmat cover, face covered, hands covered, because they were typically testing water out in like lakes and oceans. And so this was their requirement. So they showed up on the project in this full protective gear, then putting further question into the tenants' minds of why do you need that protection to test the water you said was safe in this space? So not only that, but there have been other projects in Mexico where we did try to send the water samples off to a lab via the mail system, which we learned was not very reliable. Some of those samples never arrived, and they do have a 24-hour hold time. And so at the time, there were not agents all in South America. They were traveling from the US. And so this meant an agent had to return multiple times to try to get the water to a lab. I believe the end result was that this agent had to actually take the test and drive back into the US and deliver it to a lab themselves because the samples kept just disappearing altogether, and we needed to get them tested. So this was years ago, but something that well certification has done both for two different industries, really for laboratories, is introduce these parameters and thresholds and requirements. And we're really pushing the labs to provide a different sort of level of service than they're used to. And of course, their willingness to do this is always based on supply and demand, because it does cost them an amount of money to be able to recalibrate their equipment to analyze different things that they're not used to. So there is kind of a cost for the lab to offer services that test for testing that maybe they don't typically in a region. But so we're pushing the labs in the market, but also equipment sometimes is not readily available in different parts of the world that meet the requirement. So the best example of that is a really great air quality device that does particulates, nitrogen dioxide, CO, all of the things that we'd want to test for. However, they're manufactured in New Zealand. And so the calibration also goes back to New Zealand. And so during COVID in particular, a lot of testing agents were using this amazing user-friendly device that was a great operationally. However, getting it calibrated during COVID meant that they were sending their devices to a lab that was not occupied, and they themselves did not have any staff in those offices to calibrate and resend the equipment out. And so we did have a real issue of a lot of the devices being unavailable to continue performance testing, and also having months and months, often 6 months of lead time before they would get their device back after calibration. So that was definitely a real challenge, and something that we're looking at as a standard development team is our calibration requirements. We're taking a really deep look at those, because we don't want to limit and have the rigor so stringent that there are not suppliers in the world who can meet it readily. We're also looking at the device requirements, and if we change the device requirement, how much can we relax the device requirement and keep the rigor of what we're trying to do, but open the market to more pieces of equipment, maybe those that are manufactured and available throughout the world versus one small place in the world where we could have this sort of backlog again. And so those are things that we're continually doing, is balancing the rigor with what's available in the market and how much do we want to push the market to be able to serve well buildings. And so it is definitely a fine balance. And luckily we have a lot of amazing subject matter experts, and we have our advisory board. So we're not sitting in a room amongst ourselves. We are bringing in industry experts who are experienced in these fields, and also getting feedback from them. That is more than just a small team of people at IWBI. It really is our entire advisory in each concept, working on the balance between rigor and availability in the market.
Well, Claire, on behalf of the International Well Building Institute's community, we want to thank you for the incredible work that you do. I do believe that you protect people's health, and it is a frontline role. It is our frontline workers that are out there. And I have so many endless stories in the history of public health where we knew that there was a problem, but we didn't have the tool, we didn't have the education, and more than anything, we didn't have the community. So there is a story we often talk about, and it's a sort of principle within epidemiology in particular, and within environmental sciences, where we talk about the precautionary principle. And part of that is to say, don't wait for it to be perfect. Don't wait until the level is zero, because it's never going to be perfect. We have to take the action. It's worth doing everything we can now to make that happen. And too often we see committees, communities that they cannot advance forward to action because they're paralyzed with perfection. If they can't meet that exact level and the exact way that they've always known how to do it, then they can't move forward with change. And so I just want to applaud you and to our community of performance testing orgs and performance testing agents about this agility of what you've had to do on, in the market, on the front lines, working with clients where we know what's right from a human health perspective. We know we have to take action in the testing, but the lab breaks down and the male sample doesn't work and people behave in ways we didn't plan. And there was a pandemic, and there's just all of these barriers to say, just give up, just make it easier, just phone it in. Don't send someone on site. I'm sure it's fine. And let me tell you, there's also countless stories I have when it's not fine. And we made up the term sick building syndrome that happened in the late 70s. And it's a host of 10 symptoms that dissipate when you leave the building. And if we were doing this work back then, I think we would have a significant influence in that. And we do this every day to make sure we prevent even more building stock from being sick buildings. So thank you for your work and your commitment to this. Thanks to the community of people that are out there in the front lines, making sure that the environments we spend time in keep us healthy. And stay tuned for more as we speak to our experts to learn more details about all the incredible work that is behind the scenes at the International Well Building Institute. Thanks, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.